Eleanor Whitmore picked up her own bag before anyone offered to help. Not because she was proud. Not because she was trying to make a point. She picked it up because she had learned a long time ago that waiting for someone to offer a hand was the fastest way to end up standing alone in the dirt. And the dirt in Willow Creek was exactly where they wanted her. She heard the laughter before she heard anything else, before the wind, before the horses, before the sound of her own boots hitting the ground. The laughter came first, the way it always did, sharp and careless, and aimed directly at her body, like it was the only thing worth noticing. She didn't look up. She already knew what they were seeing. She had been seeing it her whole life through other people's eyes. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get back to Eleanor, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about strength. Eleanor set her bag down on the platform and stood still for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all she allowed herself. 1, to feel the sting of it. 2, to let it pass through her without taking root. 3, to decide what she was going to do next. Then she picked the bag back up, squared her shoulders, and walked forward. Thomas Carter was standing near the post rail, hat in hand, and she knew him the moment she saw him. Not because he was handsome, though he was in the weathered, sun-beaten way of a man who had spent too many years fighting land that didn't want to cooperate. She knew him because of the expression on his face. She had seen that expression before on men who had placed an advertisement and then stood waiting at the result of it, hoping for one thing and quietly bracing themselves for another. He was bracing. She could see it in the way he held his hat, turning the brim with both hands, a nervous gesture controlled, but not quite controlled enough. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the careful blankness he was trying to wear over whatever he actually felt. She stopped in front of him and looked him straight in the eye. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Carter, I suppose." "Not yet," she said. "Not until we've spoken. I don't think it's wise to finish a transaction before both parties understand what they're agreeing to." That surprised him. She could tell because the careful blankness slipped for just a moment and something more genuine flickered underneath it. Curiosity, maybe. Or the very early edge of respect. "Fair enough," he said. Behind her she could still hear them. 2 women near the dry goods store. A group of men by the livery. A younger girl who hadn't learned yet that cruelty was something to be ashamed of, laughing freely and without any attempt to hide it. Eleanor did not turn around. She did not give them the satisfaction of knowing she had heard. Thomas heard them too. She watched his jaw tighten. "I apologize," he said low, "for the way they—" "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "If you apologize for them, you give them more importance than they deserve. And I've been doing this long enough to know they are not worth the breath." He looked at her then. Really looked, for what she understood was probably the first time since she had stepped off the coach. Not at her size, not at her dress or her boots or the worn leather bag she was carrying. At her face, at her eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Not rudely, genuinely. "Same thing you are," she said. "Trying to build something worth keeping." He didn't answer right away. The men at the livery said something she couldn't make out, and one of them laughed, and Thomas's hand tightened around the brim of his hat. "Come on," he said finally. "I'll show you the ranch." The ride out was quiet for the first several minutes. Eleanor sat on the bench of the wagon and looked at the land, and Thomas drove without speaking, which she appreciated. She had found in her life that men who talked too much during silences were usually men who were uncomfortable with the truth, and she needed to know what kind of man Thomas Carter was before she decided anything else. The truth of the ranch revealed itself slowly and in pieces, the way bad news usually did. The fencing was uneven, not broken, but badly maintained. The barn roof had been patched in at least 3 places she could count from the road. The garden behind the main house had not been tended properly in what looked like most of a season, the soil cracked and the rows gone crooked without anyone to correct them. She noticed a water pump near the kitchen door that listed slightly to the left, as though the ground beneath it had shifted and nobody had fixed it yet. She noticed all of this without saying a word. Thomas seemed to be waiting for her to say something. When she didn't, he said, "It's not in the best shape. I won't pretend otherwise." "I can see that," she said. "I had help," he said. "Last year. Before my foreman left. Before—" He stopped. "It's been a harder few years than I'd like to admit." "Most honest things are," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "You're not what I expected." "I know," she said. "Nobody ever says that as a compliment, but I take it as one." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way, but it came close. The kitchen was the first place she asked to see. Not the house, not the sleeping quarters. The kitchen, and he led her there without argument, which told her something useful about him. A man who argues when a woman asks to see the kitchen is a man who is already deciding what she's worth before she's had a chance to demonstrate it. Thomas didn't argue. He just opened the door and stepped aside. The kitchen told her everything. It wasn't filthy, but it was the kitchen of a household that had been surviving instead of living. The shelves held what they needed to hold, and nothing more. The iron stove was functional, but hadn't been properly seasoned in what looked like years. There was a smell underneath the surface of the room, not rot, just the particular sadness of a space that had stopped being cared for. She walked the length of it, slowly opening the small pantry door, checking the dry goods, counting what was there, and calculating what was missing. "You feed how many men?" she asked. "7, he said. 8 if you count Dawson, who's mostly retired but won't admit it." "What are they eating?" He paused. "Salt pork, biscuits mostly. Whatever's quick." She turned around and looked at him. "How long have they been eating like that?" The pause before he answered told her the answer before he said it. "Since my wife passed," he said. 14 months. She nodded once. She did not offer condolences immediately because this was not the moment for them, and she had learned that offering condolences at the wrong moment felt like closing a door on something that was still trying to breathe. "I'm going to need to go into town tomorrow," she said. "For what?" "Supplies I didn't see in the pantry. And I need to speak to whoever handles the accounts because some of what you're spending on salt pork could be redirected and feed these men better for less money over the long term. But that's a conversation for tomorrow, tonight." She moved to the stove and began checking the grate, assessing what she had to work with. "Tonight I'm going to cook dinner." "Mrs. Carter." "Eleanor," she said. He stopped. "Eleanor," he said, and something about the way he said it carefully, like he was trying it out and finding it unfamiliar but not unpleasant, made her pause for just a moment before she went back to what she was doing. "You just arrived. You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's exactly why I'm going to." He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said quietly, "I'll have Samuel bring in more wood." "Thank you," she said. "And tell him I'll need the good cutting board. I can see it there on the shelf, but I don't want to reach for someone else's things without asking first." He left. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, and she let herself feel the weight of where she was. Far from home, surrounded by people who had already decided she was a joke. Married to a man she had only just met, a man who was kind enough, she thought, but who was also grieving and exhausted, and trying very hard not to show either one. She breathed in and breathed out. Then she opened the pantry and started to work. She found more than she expected. Not much more, but enough. There were dried beans that nobody had bothered to soak, which told her the men had been choosing speed over nourishment every single day. There was a small supply of onions that hadn't gone off yet. Root vegetables in a crate near the back wall. A jar of something she opened and smelled carefully, a preserved tomato paste, good, still good. Flour lard, a small tin of molasses. And hanging near the back door, a side of beef that had been there probably 2 days waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. She decided. By the time the sun was starting to go orange through the kitchen window, the stove was going properly, and the smell coming from the pots was something that hadn't existed in that kitchen in a very long time. She didn't hear the men come in from the day's work. She only knew they had arrived because the sound of the bunkhouse door changed, and then the sounds from outside changed. And then she heard very faintly the particular kind of quiet that falls over men who have smelled something good and don't quite know what to do with the feeling it brings up. She kept working. Samuel Dawson came to the kitchen doorway first. He was older than she expected. White-haired and bow-legged with a face like old saddle leather, and he stood in the doorway and sniffed the air the way an animal does when it is trying to determine whether something is safe. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Evening," she said without turning around. "You're Samuel." "Yes, ma'am, Samuel Dawson. And you're the new—" He stopped, started again. "You're Mrs. Carter." "I am," she said. "Tell me, Samuel, when's the last time someone made a proper pot roast on this ranch?" He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. His face had done something she hadn't expected. Something complicated and old, and a little bit broken, like a lock that had just been opened after a long time rusted shut. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and his voice had dropped low. "That smells like—" He stopped again. "My mother used to make something that smelled exactly like that. Sit down," she said. "Dinner's about 20 minutes out." He sat. The other men filed in one by one, tentative in the way men are when they are not sure what to expect, and each one of them stopped when the smell hit them, and each one of them did something slightly different with their face, but all of them carried the same core of it, that complicated open thing that happens to people when something reaches them somewhere they had stopped expecting to be reached. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. Thomas came in last. He stood at the edge of the room and watched his men take their seats at the long table, watched them wait, watched the way they were already leaning slightly forward, something they probably didn't even know they were doing. Eleanor brought the roast to the table. Then the vegetables braised low and slow until they had given up everything harsh in them and kept only what was sweet. The biscuits golden and stacked. The gravy dark and deep, and made from everything that had been in the bottom of the pot. She sat down at the far end of the table and folded her hands. "Go ahead," she said. The first man reached for the roast. The table went silent, the way a room goes silent in a church when something true is being said. Not the silence of discomfort, the silence of people who have just received something they hadn't known they needed. Samuel Dawson was the first one to speak. He had taken one bite, and he had put his fork down, and he was looking at his plate, and then he looked up at Eleanor at the far end of the table and he said, "I haven't tasted food like this since my mother's kitchen." His voice cracked on the last word. Nobody laughed. One of the younger men, she would learn his name, was Pete, looked down at his plate and swallowed hard. Another man, heavy-set and red-bearded, just kept eating very steadily and very quietly, in the way of a man who is afraid that if he stops, the moment will end. Thomas was still standing in the doorway. She met his eyes across the length of the table and held them. He had expected her to fail. She had known that since the moment she saw his face at the stagecoach platform. She had known it the way she always knew it, the way a woman knows when the room has already decided what she can and cannot do. She watched him understand in real time that he had been wrong. He didn't say anything. He walked to the empty chair at the head of the table, and he sat down, and he reached for the biscuits, and he ate. He ate like a man who had forgotten that food could be something other than fuel. He ate like a man who was very quietly being undone by something he couldn't name yet. After dinner, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Thomas was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she had made, and not asked permission to make, he said, "That was—" He stopped. "It was a pot roast," she said. "With what you had on hand." "It was more than that," he said. She began cleaning the table. "Most good things are," she said. "That's the part people miss when they decide something is ordinary before they've given it a chance to show them what it really is." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Eleanor. "Why did you come here?" She stopped what she was doing. She set down the cloth she was using and turned to look at him, and she said the thing that she had been carrying with her since before she ever answered his advertisement. The thing that was true and simple and had been dismissed by everyone who had ever heard it, Because they saw her and decided the answer couldn't possibly be something worth taking seriously. Because I am very good at this, she said, and I was tired of being in places that wouldn't let me prove it. Thomas Carter looked at his wife across the dim kitchen, in the particular quiet that falls after a long day, when the work is done, and the food has been eaten, and the world has narrowed down to just the two people left in the room. "Well," he said finally. He picked up his coffee. "I reckon you've proved it." But what Eleanor didn't know, sitting there in the warmth of that kitchen, was that there were people in Willow Creek who had already heard about the meal. Already heard, and were already deciding that a woman like Eleanor Whitmore, large and plain, and from somewhere else, had no business making men feel things like that. Had no business making a ranch like Carter's feel like something worth saving. And those people were not going to sit quietly and let her keep going. The morning after the pot roast, Eleanor was up before sunrise. Not because she couldn't sleep. She had slept better than she had in months, deep and clean, and without the particular anxiety that had followed her for years, in a place where everyone already knew what they thought of her. She was up because there was work to do, and she had never once in her life waited for permission to start doing it. She built the fire in the kitchen stove before anyone else was stirring. She put water on. She took inventory of everything in the pantry this time with paper and a stub of pencil. She pulled from her bag, writing down numbers with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this calculation her whole life. How much was there? How long it would last? What was missing? What was being wasted? What could be redirected? The numbers were not good. They were not catastrophic, but they were the numbers of a household that had been bleeding slowly for a long time, without anyone stopping to notice how much had already been lost. She was still writing when Samuel Dawson appeared in the doorway, hat already on boots, already laced with the particular look of a man who expected to find the kitchen empty and had not prepared himself for it to be otherwise. He stopped. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Morning, Samuel." She didn't look up from the paper. "Coffee's on. Pour yourself a cup and sit down. I have a question for you." He poured the coffee. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup and waited with the patience of a man who had learned a long time ago that the best thing you could do when a competent woman was thinking was stay quiet until she was ready to talk. "Who handles the supply accounts?" she asked. "Mr. Carter does it himself," Samuel said. "Or he did. Lately it's just been—" He paused. "He signs what gets put in front of him. Ain't had much energy for the details." She wrote something else down. "And the salt pork, where does it come from?" "Briggs Mercantile in town. We got a standing order." "How much is he paying per pound?" Samuel told her. She looked up for the first time. "That's 30% above what the supplier out of Laramie charges," she said. "For the same product." Samuel blinked. "Well," he said slowly, "Mr. Briggs, he's always been the one we dealt with, since before I can remember." "I'm sure he has," Eleanor said, "and I'm sure Mr. Briggs appreciates it very much." She went back to her paper. "Tell me about the cattle, the ones that have been losing value. Is it the feed or is it the grazing rotation or both?" Samuel set down his coffee cup. He looked at her the way men look at things they are trying to recategorize in their minds, something they had placed in one box that clearly belonged in another. "Both," he said carefully. "The south pasture's been overgrazed going on 2 seasons. We ain't had enough hands to move the herd proper. And Thomas knows this. He does." Samuel was quiet for a beat. "He just ain't had—" He stopped again, started over. "Losing Mrs. Carter, the first Mrs. Carter, it took something out of him. Something he ain't got back yet." Eleanor heard that and set her pencil down. She looked at Samuel Dawson across the kitchen table, this old bow-legged man with his coffee and his worn hat, and his face that had seen too much and kept going anyway, and she said, "Did you love her? The first Mrs. Carter?" Samuel's face did something private and old. "She was a good woman," he said. "This place was alive when she was in it, and then it wasn't." Eleanor nodded. She picked up her pencil. "I'm not trying to replace her," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. I don't want anyone here thinking that's what this is." "Then what is it?" Samuel asked. Not unkindly. Just directly the way old men ask things when they've decided they no longer have time for anything but the direct path. "It's me," she said, "doing what I'm good at, in a place where it might actually matter." She looked at her list. "Now, the eggs. Are there chickens, or has that gone too?" There were chickens. 12 of them kept in a pen behind the barn, tended by nobody in particular, and producing less than they should have been because the feed had been inconsistent and nobody had checked them properly in weeks. Eleanor added chickens to her list. She added the kitchen garden. She added the pump that listed to the left and the fencing near the north pasture and the roof of the barn. By the time Thomas came into the kitchen an hour later, she had filled both sides of the paper. He stopped when he saw it. "What is that?" he asked. "Breakfast first," she said. "The list after." She had made biscuits and gravy, proper gravy with the drippings from last night and flour and milk, and she put it on the table in front of him and sat down across from him with her own plate and her coffee and the list face down beside her elbow. He ate. She ate. Then she turned the list over and slid it across the table to him. He read it in silence. She watched his face while he read it. She had learned early in her life that the most important information about a person was not what they said, but what they did with their face when they received difficult news. Some people got angry. Some people went blank. Some people, the rarer kind, got very still in the particular way of someone who was trying to absorb something real without flinching away from it. Thomas Carter got very still. He read the whole list. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the table and put his hand flat on top of it, not pushing it away, just steadying it as if it were something that might escape if he let it go. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he asked. "Since before sunrise," she said. "You were supposed to be resting." "I don't rest well when I can see what needs doing," she said. "I never have." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Briggs account. That's been my father started that account, before I took over the ranch." "I understand," she said. "Loyalty is worth something, but not at 30% above market rate when the ranch is already struggling." He looked at the list again. "The South Pasture rotation. I know about that. I just haven't had enough. Hands," she said. "I know. Samuel told me." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Thomas, can I ask you something honestly?" He looked at her. "Go ahead." "When you placed that advertisement," she said, "what were you hoping for? What did you actually need?" He didn't answer immediately. She gave him time because she had found that the real answer to a question like that usually lived a few layers below the first thing a person thought to say, and it took a moment to get there. "Someone to help," he said finally. "Just someone to help. I've been holding this place together alone for over a year and I'm tired. I'm so tired I stopped being able to see it clearly anymore." "I know," she said. "I can see that you're tired. It's in everything." He looked at her sharply, not offended, just startled by the directness. "I'm not saying it to wound you," she said. "I'm saying it because tired men make different decisions than clear-headed ones. And you need someone next to you who can see what you can't right now." She tapped the list. "I can see it. Let me help you fix it." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way light shifts when a cloud moves so gradual, you almost miss it, and then suddenly the whole landscape looks different. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. "What do you want to do first?" "I want to go into town," she said. "I want to speak to someone at the bank, and I want to visit the supplier my neighbor back in Ohio used because I wrote to them before I came out here, and they do ship to Wyoming." He stared at her. "You wrote to a supplier before you even arrived." "I wrote to 3, she said. "I believe in being prepared. For the first time sitting in that kitchen with the morning light coming in and the biscuits half eaten between them." Thomas Carter laughed. Not politely, not carefully. A real laugh, short and surprised and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had not been caught off guard in a long time and hadn't expected to enjoy it. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. It was a beginning. The ride into Willow Creek that afternoon was different from the day before. Eleanor sat straight on the wagon bench and watched the town come into view with the same focused attention she had given the kitchen, the pantry, the pasture rotation notes. She was cataloging. She was learning. She was building a picture of this place that went deeper than what the surface showed. Thomas drove and said little, but it was a different kind of quiet than the day before. Less guarded. Less like a man waiting for a verdict. The town watched them arrive the way small towns watch everything. From windows. From doorways. With the particular unhurried interest of people who had already talked once this morning and were looking for new material. She heard it before she saw the woman it was coming from. A voice carrying on the clear, dry Wyoming air with the confidence of someone who had never once considered that she might be wrong about anything. Well, there she is. The one Thomas sent away for. Eleanor did not turn her head. "Lord have mercy," the same voice said. "He must be in worse shape than we thought." Thomas's hand tightened on the reins. "Don't," Eleanor said quietly. "She's talking about you," he said low and tight. "She's talking about herself," Eleanor said. "She just doesn't know it yet." She looked straight ahead. "Pull up in front of the bank first. That's the most important stop." He pulled up in front of the bank. The woman with the carrying voice was Margaret Hale, wife of the alderman president of 3 different church committees, and the foremost authority in Willow Creek on who deserved to belong and who did not. Eleanor would learn all of this later. In this moment, she simply registered the woman's existence the way she registered all obstacles, as something to be understood, navigated, and ultimately made irrelevant by the quality of the work. The bank manager was a man named Howard Pritchett, round and careful, and accustomed to the particular power that comes from being the person who holds the numbers. He looked at Eleanor across his desk with the polite blankness of a man who had already decided she was not the relevant party in this meeting and was waiting for Thomas to take over. Thomas did not take over. He sat in the chair beside Eleanor and looked at her and waited. Pritchett recalibrated, slightly. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "what can I do for you today?" "You can tell me the exact terms of the loan currently held against Carter Ranch," she said. "The interest rate, the outstanding balance, the remaining term, and the penalty schedule for early repayment." Pritchett's polite blankness slipped, just briefly. "That's rather specific." "I'm a rather specific person," she said. "The documents, please." He got the documents. He laid them out on the desk between them. Eleanor read them with the same focused quiet she brought to everything, and Pritchett watched her read them, and she could tell by the slight shift in his posture that he had expected her to be overwhelmed by them or to need them explained, and he was finding the reality of the situation confusing. "The interest rate is punitive," she said when she had finished. "It's the standard rate for what kind of borrower?" she asked. "Because the standard rate for a ranch this size with this much collateral is considerably lower than what's listed here." "Who negotiated this loan?" Pritchett looked at Thomas. Thomas said, "I did, 2 years ago. After—" He stopped. "After my wife passed." Eleanor looked at this number again. She thought about what Samuel had said. About Thomas losing something he hadn't gotten back. About a man who had been so hollowed out by grief that he had sat across from this desk and signed a document with a punitive interest rate, and probably hadn't even fully read it. She set the paper down. "I'd like to discuss renegotiation," she said. "And I'd also like to discuss a small additional line of credit which I will need for the supply chain adjustments I'm putting in place. I have projections." She reached into her bag and produced a folded piece of paper. Pritchett looked at it, then at her, then at Thomas. Thomas said nothing. His face said everything. He was watching his wife as if he was seeing something he hadn't known existed and wasn't yet sure what to do with the knowledge. The projections were simple and clean and logical, and Pritchett, to his credit, read them carefully. Eleanor watched him read them the same way she had watched Thomas read the list that morning. She was good at reading people through the back of documents. She had learned that somewhere between her grandmother's kitchen and the first time she'd run a household budget at 19 and turned a deficit into a surplus in 4 months. "These are ambitious," Pritchett said. "These are achievable," she said, "given the current assets of the ranch and the market conditions in this region. I've priced it conservatively. The real numbers will likely be better." "You've been here how long?" he said. And this time, there was something in his voice that was not quite dismissive anymore. Not quite convinced either. Somewhere new. "Since yesterday evening," she said. "But I've been thinking about it longer than that." He looked at the projections again. Then he said carefully, "I'd need a week to review this properly." "Of course," she said. "I'll come back in a week." She stood, and both men stood with her, automatically the reflex of men in the presence of someone who had just quietly established authority. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Pritchett." Outside on the boardwalk in front of the bank, Thomas stood beside her for a moment without speaking. "Those projections," he finally said. "Where did you—" "I've been managing household accounts since I was 16, she said. "And running a boarding house in Cleveland for the last 3 years. You learn to make numbers work or you don't eat." She looked down the main street of Willow Creek, clocking where things were, what was where, who was watching. "Briggs Mercantile is 2 doors down. I'd like to go there next." "Eleanor." She looked at him. "You managed a boarding house," he said. 12 rooms, she said. "Full most of the year. I left because the owner died and his son wanted to run it himself. Into the ground, as it turned out. But that wasn't my problem anymore." She started walking. "Come on. I want to talk to Briggs before Margaret Hale gets there first and tells him something unflattering." He caught up with her in 2 strides. "You heard that. I hear everything," she said. "I just choose what to respond to." Briggs Mercantile smelled like tobacco and dried goods, and the particular dusty sweetness of a store that had been in the same place for a long time. The man behind the counter was 50-ish, wide-shouldered, with a face that was more shrewd than unkind. He looked at Eleanor and then at Thomas, with the careful measurement of a man calculating what this visit was about. "Mr. Carter," he said. "Didn't expect to see you today. My wife wanted to come in," Thomas said. "Eleanor, this is Franklin Briggs." "Mr. Briggs," Eleanor said. "I wanted to speak with you directly about the Carter account." Briggs leaned on the counter. "Oh, I've reviewed the current pricing structure," she said, "and I wanted to give you the opportunity to revisit it before I make other arrangements. I believe in doing business with people locally when it's possible. But I also believe in fair pricing, and what the Carter account is currently paying for salt pork alone is about 30 cents above what the same product costs through the Laramie supplier." Briggs' expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. A slight recalculation. "The Laramie supplier has minimum order requirements," he said. "I know," she said. "I've already written to them. The Carter account will meet the minimum once I've implemented the food service expansion I'm planning for the ranch. So the question is whether you'd like to match the rate and keep our business local, or whether you'd prefer I take the account to Laramie." There was a silence in the store that felt like the moment before weather changed. Then Briggs said, slow and considering, "What kind of food service expansion?" She told him. "Not all of it. Just enough. Just the part about the cattle drive crews and the railroad workers and the community meals. She was planning just enough that Briggs could do his own calculation about how much of that business might eventually come through his store if he played this right. She watched him do the math. "I can give you 22 cents off the current rate," he said. 28, she said. 25, he said. "Done," she said, and put out her hand, and he shook it with the slight dazed expression of a man who had sat down to play a card game and discovered part way through that the other player was carrying a completely different deck. Thomas didn't say a word until they were back outside and walking toward the wagon. Then he said, "Did you just negotiate with Franklin Briggs?" "I did," she said. "He hasn't changed a price on a Carter account in 15 years, Thomas said. "He also hasn't had anyone on the Carter account who knew the Laramie rate," she said, and climbed up to the bench and settled her skirts and waited. Thomas climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. He did not immediately signal the horse to move. He sat there for a moment looking straight ahead down the main street of Willow Creek, and Eleanor could see something working in his face, something real and unguarded and complicated. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For the way I felt when I saw you step off that coach," he said. I wasn't what you deserved. In that moment. The way I—" He stopped. "I was thinking about what other people were thinking, instead of just seeing you." She held his gaze for a moment. She didn't rush to fill the silence. "You were honest just now," she said. "That matters to me more than what happened at the platform." "It shouldn't," he said. "Maybe not," she said. "But it does." She looked down the street again. "Take me home, Thomas. I want to start on the kitchen garden before dark." He clicked the reins. They rode back toward the ranch in a different kind of quiet than they had ridden out in, and Eleanor felt the particular weight of something settling around her, not comfortable, yet not easy, but real. The way a foundation feels real solid and rough-edged and holding. She didn't know on that ride that Margaret Hale was already standing in the parlor of Henry Caldwell's boarding house telling him exactly what she had seen in front of the bank and the mercantile that afternoon. She didn't know that Henry Caldwell, who owned the largest commercial kitchen in Willow Creek and had built half his income on feeding the cattle drive crews and railroad workers. Eleanor was already planning to feed, was listening to Margaret Hale with a very particular kind of quiet. The quiet of a man who had already decided this was a problem. And the quiet of a man who had already started deciding what to do about it. Back at the ranch, Eleanor tied on her apron and went to look at the kitchen garden in the dying afternoon light. The soil was hard. It had been neglected so long it had forgotten what it was supposed to do. She crouched down and pressed her fingers into it and felt the depth of the damage, the dryness, the compaction, the years of being overlooked. Pete, the youngest of the ranch hands, drifted over from the direction of the barn and stood nearby with his hands in his pockets watching her. "You gonna try to fix that?" he asked. He sounded neither hopeful nor doubtful. Just genuinely curious the way young people are before the world has taught them to lead with skepticism. "I'm going to try," she said. "It's been dead a long time," he said. She looked up at him. He was 17, maybe 18, with an open face and ears that were slightly too big for his head, and the earnest awkwardness of a boy who hadn't quite figured out yet how to carry himself in the world. "Pete," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know what the difference is between ground that's dead and ground that's just been forgotten?" He thought about it. Genuinely thought, which she appreciated. "No, ma'am," he said honestly. "Neither does the ground," she said. "That's the whole point. You add water, you break it up, you give it something to work with. It doesn't know the difference between being abandoned and being saved. It just knows what you put into it." Pete looked at the garden, then at her. Something moved in his face, the specific expression of a young person receiving a piece of information that they know applies to more than what's being discussed, but aren't quite old enough to say so. "You want help?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "before the day's work starts. I'll need 2 people who don't mind getting their hands dirty." "I don't mind," he said immediately, then quieter. "And I think Dawson would want to. He used to tend it, before." She nodded and stood up, brushing the soil off her hands. Tell him I'd welcome the company." Pete nodded and turned to go. "And Pete," she said. He looked back. "Thank you," she said. "For the wood last night. For telling Samuel about the cutting board. For all of it." He went very pink across the tops of his ears. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and headed back toward the barn at a speed that suggested he needed a moment to compose himself. Eleanor almost smiled. That evening after supper, after the men had returned to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, and Thomas had gone over the accounts with the focused grimness of a man trying to see something clearly in bad light, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her pencil and her plans. She wrote for an hour. Menus, supply schedules, a timetable for the kitchen garden restoration, notes on the cattle rotation that she wanted to raise with Thomas when the moment was right. A rough draft of the letter she planned to send to the foreman of the Northern Pacific Survey crew, who she had read in the newspaper, was working a section 40 miles east and would need to feed 60 men for the next several months. She was deep in the letter when Thomas appeared in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come back. She looked up. He was watching her write. "You should sleep," he said. "In a little while," she said. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her, the same way he had sat that morning, and he looked at the notebook full of her precise small handwriting. "Eleanor," he said. "Hmm?" "What you said to Pete. About the garden. About the difference between dead and forgotten." She looked up. His face was different tonight than it had been this morning. Something had moved in it over the course of the day, working its way through the way soil works after it's been broken up and watered, finding its natural state again. "I heard it," he said. "I was near the barn." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "that maybe this ranch is more like that garden than I understood. That maybe I've been calling it dead for a year when it was just waiting." She didn't say anything. She let him have the thought. "You think it can come back?" he asked. And for the first time the question wasn't about the garden or the ranch at all. Eleanor set her pencil down. "Thomas," she said carefully, "I think the things that matter most are very rarely as lost as they seem when you're standing in the dark." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a single small movement, and stood. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. "Good night, Thomas." He went down the hall. She picked up her pencil. She turned back to the letter to the survey foreman. She wrote until the candle burned low and the kitchen settled around her into quiet. And somewhere in the distance, out past the dark of the yard and the barns and the overgrown kitchen garden, Willow Creek sat with its judgments and its whispers and its Henry Caldwells and its Margaret Hales and Eleanor Whitmore, who had been called too much of everything that didn't matter and not enough of anything that did kept writing. The letter to the Northern Pacific Survey foreman went out on a Tuesday. The reply came back on a Friday. Eleanor read it standing at the kitchen counter, still in her apron flour on her wrists from the morning's baking, and when she finished reading, she set it down very carefully on the table and stood still for a moment, with both hands flat on the surface. Then she picked up her pencil and started writing numbers. Thomas found her like that 20 minutes later. He came in from the north pasture with mud on his boots and dust on his collar, and he stopped when he saw her face. "Good news or bad?" he asked. She slid the letter across the table without looking up from her numbers. He read it. She kept writing. The only sound in the kitchen was her pencil and the fire in the stove. "They want to contract for 60 men, he said. 3 meals a day. For 11 weeks, she said. Starting in 6 weeks, which gives us exactly enough time to get the supply chain in order and hire 2 more kitchen hands." Thomas set the letter down. "Eleanor, this is enough to clear the back half of the loan," she said. "If we're careful. And if Pritchett agrees to the renegotiation, which I believe he will because I sent him the revised projections yesterday and included the survey crew contract as a line item." Thomas sat down slowly, like a man whose legs have just received information his head hasn't caught up with yet. "You sent him projections before you had the contract." "I sent him projections based on the expectation of the contract," she said. "There's a difference. I knew they'd say yes. Their last survey cook quit in Cheyenne. They've been feeding 60 men on hard biscuits and tinned beans for 3 weeks. I knew they'd say yes." He stared at her. "How did you know about the cook in Cheyenne?" he asked. "The railroad agent in town, Mr. Hess. I spoke to him last Wednesday when you were at the farrier." She finally looked up. "I talk to people, Thomas. People know things. You just have to ask the right ones, the right questions." He picked up the letter again. He read it again. She watched him read it the way she'd been watching him read things for 2 weeks now, learning the language of his face, the way his jaw shifted when he was processing something significant, the way his eyes went still when he was trying not to show what he was feeling. He was trying very hard not to show what he was feeling right now. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "It changes the numbers," she said. "That's a start." He looked at her across the table. "You've been planning this since before the bank visit." "Since before I arrived," she said. "I told you, I came prepared." Something moved in Thomas Carter's face, then something deep and slow and real. The look of a man who has been holding a sinking ship together alone for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to have something hold with him instead of against him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Eleanor saw it and noted it and went back to her numbers because that was the kindest thing she could do for him in that moment. Let him have the feeling without an audience. Outside, Pete was crossing the yard at a dead run. She heard his boots on the porch steps before he hit the door. He came in breathing hard hat half off his head, with the particular wild look of a young man who has just learned something and cannot contain it. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "you need to know something." She set her pencil down. "Catch your breath first." He caught two of them. "Henry Caldwell," he said. "He was at the feed store this morning. I was in the back, he didn't see me. He was talking to Mr. Greer about the survey crew contract." He stopped, looked at Thomas. "He knows about it," he said. Pete's jaw tightened with the specific righteous anger of a young man who has overheard something unfair being said about someone he respects. He said he was going to make sure the railroad boys knew they'd be better off eating at the boarding house. He said he had connections at the railroad office in Cheyenne, and he'd use them. The kitchen went quiet. Thomas's face went hard in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before. "Caldwell has no business interfering in—" "He has every business interfering," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm. Not the calm of someone who wasn't affected. The calm of someone who had decided that being affected was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "He has a boarding house that depends on that kind of contract. We are a direct threat to his income. Of course he's going to fight it." "He can't just—" "He can," she said, "and he will." She looked at Pete. "Thank you. That was important. You did right by us telling me." Pete nodded, still vibrating with indignation. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to think," she said. "That's what I'm going to do right now. Pete, go back to your work. Don't say anything about this to anyone. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said and left, and the door banged shut behind him with the energy of someone who really wanted to do something more active but was restraining himself. Thomas looked at Eleanor. "Caldwell's been the big man in this town for 30 years. He's got the alderman in his pocket, and half the business owners owe him favors. If he makes calls to Cheyenne, then we make sure they've already signed with us before he makes those calls," she said. "The foreman said 6 weeks. I know what he said." She pulled the letter back toward her and picked up her pencil. "I'm going to send a reply today asking to move the start date up by 2 weeks. We'll be ready in 4. We'll be better than ready." "Eleanor, 4 weeks is tight," she said. "I know. We'll need to hire faster than I planned. And I'm going to need you to go to Laramie yourself to confirm the supply order, because a telegram can be intercepted, and a man standing in front of another man is harder to dismiss." She was writing as she talked, the words coming out even and quick and precise. "I also need you to speak to Hess at the railroad office here before Caldwell does. Today, if possible. Hess likes you. He liked your father. Go talk to him, not about the contract, just about the ranch, about what we're building. Let him hear it from you before Caldwell gets there." Thomas was already standing. "I'll go now." "Good." She didn't look up. "And Thomas." He stopped at the door. "When you talk to Hess," she said, "don't sell it. Just tell him the truth. People can always smell it when you're selling them something. Just tell him what's actually happening here and let him decide." He held her gaze for a moment. "You know," he said, "most people who are this good at strategy try to hide it." "Most people who hide their strategy," she said, "are doing it because they don't trust the people around them." She looked at him steadily. "I trust you, Thomas." He stood in the doorway another second. Then he put his hat on and left. Eleanor wrote the reply to the survey foreman. She wrote it in her clearest, most deliberate hand. The way she wrote everything that mattered. Not performing confidence, just carrying it, the way she had always carried things, because there had never been anyone else to do it for her. Henry Caldwell made his move the following Monday. Eleanor knew about it before noon, because Margaret Hale told Reverend Tilden's wife, who told the woman who sold butter at the market, who happened to be the same woman Eleanor had spent 40 minutes with the previous Thursday, discussing the possibility of supplying eggs and cream to the Carter kitchen operation at a favorable rate. The woman's name was Ruth Baines. She was 63, sharp-eyed, and had no particular affection for Henry Caldwell, who had underpaid her husband for a delivery job 3 years ago and never apologized for it. She found Eleanor at the back of the mercantile and said low and direct, "Caldwell sent a letter to the railroad office in Cheyenne this morning, rode out to the telegraph office at first light. Margaret Hale saw him do it and told half the town by breakfast." Eleanor thanked her. She bought 2 pounds of butter at the agreed rate. She walked to the front of the store where Franklin Briggs was watching her with the careful attention of a man who had been recalibrating his opinion of Eleanor Whitmore Carter for 2 weeks and still wasn't done. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "do you have writing paper?" "Behind the counter," he said. "I'd like to use your counter," she said, "if you don't mind." He minded slightly, she could tell, but he moved aside anyway, the way people moved aside for Eleanor when they'd already learned the cost of underestimating her. She stood at Franklin Briggs's counter in the middle of his mercantile and wrote a letter to the regional director of the Northern Pacific Railroad, a man named Charles Aldrin, whose name she had found in the 3rd letter she had written before leaving Cleveland, the letter she had never needed until now. She wrote about Carter Ranch. She wrote about the contract. She wrote about the food operation she was building, the numbers, the supply chain, the capacity, the reputation already being established in the region. She wrote it in one draft clean and without corrections because she had been composing it in her head since Pete had come through that kitchen door breathing hard. She folded the letter and addressed it. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "does the eastbound stage go out today?" 2 o'clock, he said. He was watching her with something that had moved considerably past calculation and into something closer to reluctant admiration. "Then I'll need postage," she said. Caldwell's letter arrived in Cheyenne first. She knew that. She couldn't change it. But she had made sure that what followed it was something considerably more detailed and considerably harder to dismiss. And she had done one more thing. She had asked Thomas to speak to every ranch owner within riding distance, not to promote the Carter operation, just to have conversations the way neighbors have conversations about what was being built and what it might mean for the region. Word spread in the West the way fire spread in dry grass, and she had learned that the best thing you could do was make sure the right fire started first. By Wednesday, Thomas had spoken to 4 ranchers. By Thursday, 2 of them had asked Eleanor directly if she might be able to supply meals for their own crews during the cattle season. She said she would consider it. She wrote their names in her notebook. That same Thursday, Henry Caldwell walked into Carter Ranch. He didn't send word ahead. He arrived in a good buggy with a good horse, dressed in the manner of a man who wanted you to understand without being told that he was someone, and he came to the front door of the main house and knocked the way men like him knock, like the door has already agreed to open before the hand comes down on it. Eleanor answered it. She had not been expecting him. She was in her good apron, and her hair was up but not fancy, and she had a dish towel in her hand, and she opened the door and looked at Henry Caldwell, who was 60, broad-faced, silver-haired, with pale eyes that were accustomed to finding what they looked for immediately and becoming irritated when they didn't. He looked at her with an expression that was almost pleasant. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'm Henry Caldwell. I believe your husband knows me." "I know you," she said. "Come in." She stepped back and let him in and showed him to the front room, which was simple and clean and betrayed nothing about the state of the ranch's finances one way or the other. She sat down across from him and put the dish towel in her lap and folded her hands on top of it. He took the chair across from her with the ease of a man who sat in other people's chairs and felt entirely at home in them. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please," she said. "You're building something here that's going to create competition I don't particularly want," he said. "I've been the primary food supplier for the railroad crews and the cattle drives in this county for 12 years. That works for me. It works for this town. Changing it creates disruption nobody benefits from." Eleanor looked at him. "Except Carter Ranch," she said. He smiled slightly. "I understand you need the income. Thomas is in a difficult position. I respect that. But there are other ways to solve a cash problem. Ways that don't require stepping into territory that's already established." "What are you offering?" she said. He blinked. He'd expected a longer preamble before that question. "I'm offering to speak to the bank about Thomas's loan," he said. I have a relationship with Pritchett. I can get the rate adjusted and the term extended. In exchange, you'd focus the Carter operation on ranch supply, only local sales domestic. Not the railroad crews, not the cattle drives. That business stays where it's been. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He seemed to take her quiet as consideration, which was what she intended. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When you came here today," she said, "did you expect me to say yes?" He paused, just slightly. "I expected you to be reasonable," he said. "I am reasonable," she said. "I'm also the person who spent 3 weeks before arriving in Wyoming writing letters to suppliers and railroad offices and survey foremen, because I understood exactly what this ranch needed, and I planned for it. So when you walk into my home and offer me a smaller version of what I've already built, I need you to understand that what you're actually offering me is nothing." The pleasant expression on Caldwell's face did not disappear. It compressed, became something flatter and more accurate. "The rate renegotiation is already in progress," she said. "I presented Pritchett with revised projections 11 days ago. He's been expecting my follow-up visit this week." Caldwell was very still. "The survey crew contract is signed," she said. "We received the countersigned copy yesterday morning." This was slightly ahead of the truth. The countersigned copy was expected by Friday, but the contract itself was agreed, and she was not going to sit in her own front room and negotiate from a position she had not earned. Caldwell set his hands on his knees. He looked at Eleanor Whitmore Carter, and she could see the recalculation happening in real time. The same recalculation she had watched in Pritchett, in Briggs, in every person who had arrived at this ranch, or at any table in her life, with a decision already made about what she was and had been required to update it against their will. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," she said. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But I want you to understand something, Mr. Caldwell, and I want you to understand it clearly, so there's no confusion between us going forward." She met his eyes and held them without effort, because she had never once in her life been afraid of a man whose only real power was that he expected her to be. "I didn't come to Willow Creek to take anything from you. I came to build something for this ranch. If that competes with what you've built, that's the nature of business in a growing territory, and I won't apologize for it. But if you decide to make this personal, if you use your connection to the alderman or the bank or anywhere else to interfere with what I'm building, I will respond. Clearly and loudly, and in front of everyone who needs to hear it." The room held the silence for 3 full seconds. Then Caldwell stood. He picked up his hat from where he'd placed it on the side table. He looked at her once more, and this time there was no pleasantness in it at all, just the clear, cold look of a man who has lost the first round and is already thinking about the second. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. She showed him to the door. She watched his buggy move down the ranch road from the front porch, and she stood there until the dust settled. And then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She was glad of that. Not because shaking would have meant she was weak, but because she had work to do and shaking would have slowed her down. Thomas came in from the barn 20 minutes later and found her at the table with her notebook. "Was that Caldwell's buggy?" he asked. "It was," she said. "He stopped walking. He came here. What did he?" "Eleanor, what did he say to you?" "He offered to help with the bank loan in exchange for us pulling out of the railroad and cattle drive business," she said. Thomas's jaw set. "He had no right to—" "He had every right to make an offer," she said. "That's business. I turned it down." "You turned it down?" Thomas looked at her. "By yourself, without—" "It was my conversation to have," she said, not harshly, but clearly. "I know you would have wanted to be there, but if he had come and found you first, the conversation would have been different. He came here because he thought I was the easier one to approach. That was his mistake, not mine." She looked up from her notebook. "Sit down, Thomas. I need to tell you everything he said so we can figure out what he's going to do next." Thomas sat. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was one of the better things about him, that he knew how to listen when something mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "He'll go after the supply lines next. He'll try to get Briggs to pull the rate deal." "I know," she said. "I've already thought about that, which is why I need to talk to Ruth Baines tomorrow about the dairy supply. If we can establish a direct supply relationship with her and 2 other farms, Caldwell can't pressure us through Briggs because we won't be dependent on the mercantile for the basics." "What about the alderman?" Thomas said. "If Caldwell uses Harmon, then we go to the meeting," she said simply. Thomas blinked. "What meeting?" "The town council meets the first Thursday of every month," she said. "I've been reading the notices. The next one is in 9 days. I think we should be there." She looked at him. "Not to fight, just to be present. To let people see what we're building and make their own decision about it. Caldwell's power comes from people not looking too closely. Let them look." Thomas was staring at her again. She had come to recognize that stare the particular quality of his attention when she said something that moved the ground under him. "You have been thinking about this for weeks," he said. "I've been thinking about this since the morning after I arrived," she said. "Since I sat in your kitchen at 4 in the morning with a piece of paper and looked at your numbers." She closed her notebook. "Thomas, I need to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "Do you trust me?" she said. "Not the plan, not the numbers. Me. Do you trust me to make decisions about this ranch the way I've been making them?" He didn't answer immediately. The fire in the stove spoke into the silence, quiet and steady. The afternoon was going golden outside the window, and somewhere across the yard, Samuel Dawson was saying something to Pete in the unhurried voice of a man with a very long story to tell. "Yes," Thomas said. The word came out plain and undecorated. "I do." Eleanor nodded once. "Good," she said. "Then here's what we're going to do." She opened her notebook again. Outside, Henry Caldwell's buggy was moving back toward Willow Creek through the late afternoon dust, and inside his head, something cold and calculating was already building its next move. He had connections. He had 30 years of favors owed and alliances built, and he had never once in his life lost a business dispute to someone the town had laughed at when she stepped off a stagecoach. But he had also never in his life sat across a parlor table from Eleanor Whitmore Carter. And that, though he didn't understand it yet, was the thing that was going to make all the difference. Because Eleanor was not building a business. She was building something that couldn't be bought, or pressured, or laughed away. She was building a place where people felt fed. And the people of Willow Creek, hungry in ways that had nothing to do with food, were already starting to understand what that meant, even if they couldn't say it out loud yet. Even if some of them would have denied it if asked on that particular afternoon in the long golden Wyoming fall. The notice for the town council meeting sat in Eleanor's notebook pressed flat between the pages of her supply ledger, and every night when she opened it to update her numbers, she saw it there. 9 days, 8 days, 7. She planned the way she always planned, quietly, completely, without telling anyone who didn't need to know. She did not plan for what happened on the 6th day. She did not plan for Samuel Dawson to come into the kitchen at dawn with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in the careful blankness of a man carrying news he does not want to deliver. She did not plan for the thing he said next, which changed the nature of the fight entirely and sent everything she had built in 6 weeks tilting sideways into territory she had not yet mapped. She did not plan for any of it. But she had been Eleanor Whitmore her entire life, and she had never once let the unplanned thing beat her. Samuel Dawson came in at dawn with his hat in both hands and his eyes on the floor, and Eleanor knew, before he said a word, that whatever he was carrying was heavy. She put down the coffee she was pouring and turned to face him. "Samuel," she said, "sit down." "I'd rather stand, ma'am," he said, "if it's all the same." She waited. He looked up at her with the face of a man who had been awake all night, deciding whether to say the thing he was about to say. "I heard something yesterday evening," he said. From my cousin who works the night shift at the telegraph office." He stopped, turned his hat in his hands. Caldwell sent 2 telegrams Wednesday night. One to the railroad office in Cheyenne. The other one to a man named Elias Wren. Eleanor went still. "Who is Elias Wren?" Samuel looked at her steadily. "He's a land agent out of Denver," he said. "Been involved in 3 different ranch foreclosures in the last 2 years. All of them started the same way. Somebody got in trouble with a bank loan, and Wren showed up, and 6 months later the land changed hands." He paused. "The Carter loan has a clause in it. If the primary income of the ranch drops below a certain threshold for 2 consecutive months, the bank can call the remainder of the note. Caldwell knows about that clause because Caldwell was on the bank board when that loan was written." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor set the coffee pot down on the stove with a careful, controlled movement. "Thomas doesn't know about the clause," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," Samuel said. "I don't believe he does." She breathed in once, slow and complete. "How did Caldwell plan to trigger at the threshold?" "That's the part I don't know for certain," Samuel said. "But if the survey crew contract fell through, or if someone convinced the local ranchers not to do business with the Carter operation, or both." He held her gaze. "He's got enough pull in this county to do either one, Mrs. Carter, if he works fast enough." She turned to the window. Outside, the ranch was waking up the way it did every morning now, with sounds that had been absent for 14 months before she arrived. Pete crossing the yard with the purpose of someone who knew where he was going. The kitchen garden, showing green at the edges, where the first growth was coming through the smell of the ranch, coming alive. She thought about the countersigned contract sitting in the top drawer of the desk in Thomas's office, the one she had filed there herself 2 days ago, the one that represented 11 weeks of meals for 60 men and the back half of the Carter loan. She thought about Elias Wren in Denver, reading a telegram over his morning coffee. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Before Wren gets here a week, maybe less. He's known to move fast." "And the threshold clause. What's the dollar amount?" Samuel told her. She did the math in her head immediately, the way she always did, clean and fast and without sentiment. "We're above it right now," she said. "Barely, but we're above it." "Yes, ma'am, but if Caldwell starts working the other ranchers—" "He already has," she said. "That's why 2 of the 4 Thomas visited last week haven't followed up." She turned back from the window. "Samuel, does Thomas know you're telling me this?" "No, ma'am," he said. "I came to you first." She looked at him for a long moment. This old man who had been on this ranch for 30 years, who had loved the first Mrs. Carter, and tended the kitchen garden, and eaten 14 months of salt pork and biscuits, and kept going anyway, and she understood what it had cost him to come to her door at dawn with this. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." He nodded once, put his hat on, and left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for exactly 90 seconds. Then she went and woke up Thomas. He was a light sleeper, the way working ranchers always were, and he was sitting up before she had finished knocking. She opened the door and stood in the frame and said, "Get dressed. We need to talk now." He heard the tone of her voice, and he was dressed in 3 minutes. She told him everything in the kitchen over coffee, plain and clean, and without softening any of it, because he was her partner in this, and he deserved the unvarnished truth. She watched his face move through the information, the way she had watched it move through the bank documents and the projections and the letter from the survey foreman, that particular quality of stillness that meant he was absorbing rather than reacting. When she finished, he said, "The clause. How did I not know about the clause?" "Because the man who wrote it into your loan knew you were grieving and counting on you not to read closely," she said. "That's not on you, that's on him." Thomas stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hand on the frame. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We need a lawyer, and we need one fast," she said. "And we need to know whether a clause like that can be challenged." "I believe it can, because the way Samuel described it, the threshold was set deliberately low enough to be triggered by a single bad season, even before Caldwell was involved. That's a predatory lending practice, and there are courts that have ruled against them." Thomas turned around. "How do you know that, Because the woman who owned the boarding house I managed in Cleveland went through something similar, she said. Her late husband had signed a note with a similar clause. She challenged it. She won. Eleanor paused. It took 8 months and cost her considerably in legal fees. We don't have 8 months, but the precedent exists. The town council meeting is in 6 days, Thomas said. I know. Caldwell will be there. I know that too. He looked at her. What do you want to do? She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She had been turning this over since the moment Samuel left building it the way she built everything from the foundation up, and she had arrived at the same place every time, which told her it was probably right. I want to go to the town council meeting, she said, and I want to bring the documents. Which documents? All of them, she said. The loan papers, the clause, the survey crew contract, the supply agreements, the financial projections. She looked at him steadily. And I want to bring Ruth Baines and Franklin Briggs and the 4 ranchers you visited and anyone else in this county who has benefited from or been promised to benefit from what we're building. I want Caldwell to walk into that meeting and find that the story he's been telling about Carter Ranch is surrounded on all sides by the actual story. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. And Wren, the land agent. If Wren shows up before the meeting, we don't hide from him, she said. We meet with him directly, we show him the contract and the projections, and we make it very clear that the financial picture of this ranch does not match whatever Caldwell told him in that telegram. She held Thomas's gaze. He's a businessman, Thomas, not a villain. He goes where there's a transaction to be made. If there's no transaction, he leaves, and if Caldwell creates the transaction, then we make sure there isn't one to create. She set her cup down. But I need you to do something for me today, right now, this morning. Name it. Go to every one of those 4 ranchers yourself, she said. Not to talk about business. Go as a neighbor. Go and tell them what Caldwell is doing. Not to ask them to choose sides, but because they deserve to know that someone is manipulating the business relationships in this county for his own benefit. Let them make an informed decision. Thomas picked up his hat from the table. And you? I'm going to find a lawyer, she said. He stopped. In Willow Creek, the only attorney here is Garrison Webb, she said. I know, he's done work for Caldwell in the past. I'm not going to use Webb. She stood. I'm going to use the postal rider to send a letter to James Alcott in Cheyenne. He's the attorney who handled the boarding house case in Cleveland. He moved west 2 years ago. I've known where he was for some time. Thomas stared at her. Eleanor, he said slowly. Did you come to Wyoming already knowing you might need a lawyer? I came to Wyoming knowing that things worth building are always worth fighting for, she said, and that fights are easier to win if you've done the thinking before they start. He stood there for another moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, and before she understood what he was doing, he had put both arms around her. Not romantically, not with any particular grace, just the embrace of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just for the first time felt the weight genuinely shared. She stood very still for a moment. Then she put one hand on his arm briefly. Go, she said. We don't have a lot of time. He went. Elias Wren arrived on Thursday. He was not what Eleanor had expected, which was, she reflected, exactly the kind of mistake she usually didn't make. She had expected a cold man, a predatory man, the kind of man who wore his ambition on his face like a badge. Wren was 45 and quiet and almost gentle in his manner, the kind of man who said please and thank you and listened carefully, and had over the course of 2 years helped transfer 3 family ranches out of the hands of the families who had built them. He came to the door of Carter Ranch in a good coat with a polite knock and introduced himself to Eleanor with a handshake and clean eyes and the careful neutrality of a man who never let you see which way he was leaning until he'd already decided. Eleanor invited him in. She gave him coffee. She let him say his piece, which was measured and reasonable and framed entirely in the language of assistance. He had heard the ranch was in some financial difficulty. He represented investors who were interested in Wyoming land. He was simply here to explore whether a conversation might be mutually beneficial. When he finished, Eleanor opened the folder she had placed on the table before he arrived. She slid the survey crew contract across to him first. He picked it up and read it, and she watched the slight recalibration in his posture, small but real. She slid the supply agreements across next. Ruth Baines's dairy agreement, the arrangement with 2 other farms, the updated Briggs account, then the financial projections, the revised ones she had sent Pritchett with the survey contract, included as a confirmed line item. Wren read all of it with the careful attention of a man who had trained himself to read documents without expressing an opinion about them. When he looked up, Eleanor said, "The loan clause that Mr. Caldwell described to you in his telegram requires the ranch's primary income to fall below a threshold for 2 consecutive months. As you can see, we are currently operating above that threshold, and our contracted income for the next 11 weeks places us considerably above it for the foreseeable future." She folded her hands on the table. "There is no transaction here, Mr. Wren. I think you were brought here under a misrepresentation of the ranch's financial situation." Wren was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "I was told—" "I know what you were told," she said. "I also know who told you." She met his eyes. "I'm not interested in your business, Mr. Wren. I'm not interested in causing you any difficulty. But I am interested in you understanding that the information you received was inaccurate, because I think you're a man who prefers to operate on accurate information." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. "You're more prepared for this conversation than most people are," he said. "I prepared for it because I knew it was coming," she said. "And I knew it was coming because the person who sent you that telegram is afraid of what this ranch is becoming." Wren sat back. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the documents on the table between them. "The survey contract," he said. "Is it solid?" "Countersigned and filed," she said. "I can show you the filed copy." He thought for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Carter." "Please," she said. "Caldwell's telegram described this ranch as 2 months from foreclosure," he said. "That's not what these documents show, not even close." "No," she said. "It isn't." Wren looked at his coffee, then at the window, then back at her with the particular expression of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer. "I've done 3 deals in this territory in 2 years," he said. "Caldwell was involved in 2 of them, peripherally. I didn't connect that until just now." Eleanor said nothing. She let him connect it. "He knows the bank board," Wren said almost to himself. "He was on it when my husband's loan was written," Eleanor said. "The clause in question was unusual. I've reviewed several other loans from the same period and the same bank. None of them carry the same threshold structure." Wren looked at her sharply. "You reviewed other loans. I asked 3 other ranchers to share their loan documents with me when Thomas visited them this week," she said. "They were kind enough to do so. The threshold clause in the Carter loan is unique. It appears to have been written specifically for this property." The silence that followed that statement was a different kind of silence than anything that had come before in that room. The kind of silence that happens when something hidden is suddenly visible. Wren set his coffee cup down. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I think I need to reconsider why I came here." "I think that would be wise," she said. He picked up the documents. He stacked them neatly and slid them back across the table to her, except for the financial projections which he held for a moment, and then placed deliberately face down on his side of the table. "May I keep the projections?" he said. "I'd like to review them more carefully." She looked at him. "Not for the purpose you might think," he said quietly. "I have contacts in Denver who fund legitimate business expansions, smaller scale than land acquisition. I've never considered food service operations before." He paused. "I might be wrong, but what you've built here in—" He glanced at the contract date. 6 weeks. That's not ordinary. Eleanor considered him. She had spent her entire adult life reading people through the information they gave her, The way they sat, the things they kept, and the things they returned, the precise location of their honesty. "You can keep the projections," she said. He stood. He shook her hand again. At the door, he stopped. "The town council meeting is tomorrow," he said. "It is," she said. "Caldwell will be there." "Yes," she said. Wren looked at her for a long moment. "I'm staying another night," he said. "I believe I'll attend." He left. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched him go and breathed. Then she went inside and sat down and wrote a letter to James Alcott in Cheyenne, telling him she would need him in Willow Creek by Monday, and enclosing a copy of the loan clause and her notes on the other rancher's documents, and 3 lines at the end that said simply, "I believe we have a case. I believe it will matter. Please come." She sealed the letter. She sent Pete to the postal writer at a dead gallop. Then she cooked dinner because the men needed to eat and the kitchen needed to smell like something good. And she had learned that the most important thing you could do in the middle of a fight was keep feeding people. Samuel stood in the kitchen doorway that evening while she worked and didn't say anything for a long time. Just watched her move through the space that had become in 6 weeks entirely hers. "He came," Samuel finally said. "Wren." "He did," she said. And he's staying for the council meeting," she said. Samuel absorbed that. "That can't make Caldwell happy." "No," she said. "It can't." She stirred the pot. "Samuel, tell me about Caldwell, not the business, the man." Samuel leaned against the doorframe. He thought for a moment. "He came here 20 years ago with not much to his name," he said. "Built the boarding house from nothing. Worked hard. I'll give him that. He's not lazy." He paused. But somewhere along the way, he decided that what he'd built only mattered if nobody else could build the same thing, like the town wasn't big enough for more than one success. He looked at Eleanor. "He's afraid of you, ma'am." "I don't think he'd say that. But that's what this is." Eleanor thought about that. "Does he have a family?" she asked. "Wife," Samuel said. "2 boys grown. They don't work with him, moved away." "Why?" Samuel was quiet for a beat. "People say the oldest one tried to start his own business. Caldwell didn't support it. Said it would compete with the boarding house." He paused. "That's the story anyway." Eleanor stirred the pot. "A man who can't let his own son succeed," she said quietly. "That's a particular kind of fear." The night before the council meeting, Thomas couldn't sleep. She knew because she couldn't sleep either. And at 2 in the morning, she came out to the kitchen and found him already there, sitting at the table with a cold cup of coffee and the loan documents spread out in front of him. He looked up when she came in. "I keep reading the clause," he said, "trying to understand how I missed it." She sat down across from him. "You were grieving," she said. "Pritchett put it on page 4 of an 8-page document during the week of the funeral. You signed what was put in front of you." "I should have been more careful." "Yes," she said. "And Caldwell should not have written a predatory clause into a loan he gave to a man burying his wife. You carry your part. He carries his." Thomas looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said to Wren, about the clause being unique to this property." "Yes," she said. "If Alcott can prove that—" "Then it's not just a renegotiation," she said. "It's a legal challenge to the loan structure itself, which means Caldwell's involvement in the bank at the time becomes relevant, which means the other 2 foreclosures Wren mentioned become relevant." Thomas was quiet. "That's bigger than I thought this was." "It's been bigger than anyone thought it was," Eleanor said. "That's why Caldwell has been so aggressive. He knows what exposure looks like." She pulled her notebook toward her and opened it to the page where she'd been tracking the timeline of events. "The meeting tomorrow isn't just about Carter Ranch. It never was." Thomas looked at the notebook, then at her. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I'm aware of what could go wrong," she said. "That's not the same as fear." "It's not the same as confidence either," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's something in between, the place where you decide to do it anyway." She looked at him. Thomas, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that what we've built here in 6 weeks is real. The contracts are real. The relationships are real. The garden is growing. The men are staying. That's real. Caldwell can't undo any of that. Thomas reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just the hand of a man reaching for the hand of the person sitting across from him in the way that people do when the words have run out and the truth of a thing needs no translation. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen, with the documents on the table between them and the ranch settling around them in the dark, and the council meeting 6 hours away. The Willow Creek Town Council met in the back room of the town hall, a plain space with long benches and a raised table at the front where the 5 council members sat. Usually the audience was sparse 3 or 4 people with specific interests in whatever item was on the agenda. That Thursday evening, there were 47 people in the room. Eleanor counted them as she and Thomas came in. She had not advertised this. Thomas had spoken to neighbors. Ruth Baines had told her dairy customers. Franklin Briggs, in the particular way of a merchant who had recalibrated his opinion and decided to land somewhere new, had apparently mentioned to several people that it might be worth attending. Henry Caldwell was already seated in the front row when they came in. He turned and saw them, and his face did the thing. It did the compression, the recalibration, the flat, pale look of a man encountering a problem he thought he had contained. He saw Wren. Wren was seated 3 rows back in the kind of careful neutrality that meant he was watching everything. Eleanor took a seat in the middle of the room, and Thomas sat beside her, and Samuel sat on her other side with his hat on his knee, and Pete sat behind them, vibrating very slightly with the concentrated energy of someone who had been told to behave himself and was taking it extremely seriously. Alderman Harmon called the meeting to order. He was a thin, careful man who was accustomed to running meetings in which Henry Caldwell had already decided the outcome, and the room's unusual fullness was making him visibly uncomfortable. He moved through the early agenda items quickly. Then he got to the item Eleanor had known was coming because she had read the agenda notice in the window of the post office 2 days ago and recognized immediately what it was. A proposal submitted by Henry Caldwell to establish a county licensing requirement for commercial food operations, including a fee structure and a review board. Harmon read it out. He did not look at Eleanor. Caldwell stood immediately to explain the proposal, using words like community standards and public health and fair business practices. And Eleanor listened to every word with the focused patience of a woman who had been listening to men explain things to rooms full of people her entire life, and had learned that the most important thing you could do while someone was talking was understand exactly what they were trying not to say. What Caldwell was trying not to say was that the licensing fee he was proposing was set at a level that a boarding house could absorb and a new ranch food operation could not in its first year. She waited until he finished. Harmon said, "Is there any response from the floor?" Eleanor stood up. The room shifted, not dramatically, but the way rooms shift when the person everyone has been waiting to speak finally speaks. "Thank you, Alderman Harmon," she said. "My name is Eleanor Carter. I operate the Carter Ranch Food Service, which is the operation Mr. Caldwell's proposal is designed to effect." She said it plainly without accusation, just as a fact the room should have in front of it. "I have a few questions about the proposal I'd like to put to the council." Harmon nodded. He looked like a man who wished he were somewhere else. "The fee structure," Eleanor said. "Can the council tell me when this fee structure was developed and what research was used to set the amount?" Caldwell said from the front row. "The amount reflects the costs of proper oversight." "That wasn't my question," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I asked when it was developed and what research supported it. Those are 2 specific questions, and I'd like specific answers." Harmon looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at Harmon. The exchange lasted 2 seconds and told the whole room everything it needed to know about the relationship between the 2 men. Ruth Baines in the back row made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "The proposal was developed this week," Harmon said carefully. "This week," Eleanor repeated. "And the research Mr. Caldwell presented So Mr. Caldwell, who operates a competing commercial food business in this county, developed a licensing proposal this week and presented it to the council without independent research and without notice to the operations it would affect. She said this at a normal conversational volume, without heat, without drama. I just want to make sure the room understands what we're discussing. The room understood. She could feel it, the shift in the air. The specific quality of attention that changes when people who had come in uncertain find themselves arriving at a position. She reached into the folder she had brought and produced 3 documents. I'd like to submit to the council's record, she said, the Carter Ranch survey crew, contract, the current supply agreements, and a financial projection for the next 12 months. I'd also like to submit a copy of the Carter Ranch loan document, specifically page 4, which contains a threshold clause that I would ask the council to examine in light of Mr. Caldwell's history with the bank board that wrote it. The room went very still. Caldwell stood. That loan document is a private financial matter and has no relevance to— It has direct relevance, Eleanor said to the question of whether a commercial licensing proposal submitted this week by a man who helped write a predatory clause into a competitor's bank loan is a matter of public health or a matter of business suppression. She looked at Harmon. I think the council would agree that those are different things. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then James Alcott, who had ridden through the night from Cheyenne and slipped into the back of the room 12 minutes after the meeting started, stood up and said, Alderman Harmon, my name is James Alcott. I'm an attorney and I represent the Carter family. I'd like to address the council about the loan document if the chair will permit it. Harmon looked like a man who had just understood that the ground under his feet was not what he had been told it was. The chair permits it, he said. Caldwell turned and looked at Alcott. Then he turned and looked at Eleanor. She met his eyes without moving. She had put everything she had into this room. The documents, the lawyer, the relationships she had spent 6 weeks building, one conversation at a time, one meal at a time, one honest exchange at a time. She had built this moment the way she built everything from the foundation up, and it was standing and it was solid, and she could feel it holding. Thomas was sitting beside her, and his hand found hers under the table, and she held it. Alcott spoke for 11 minutes. He was calm and precise and devastating in the way that real lawyers are devastating, not with volume, but with the specific weight of documented fact laid down in sequence. He addressed the loan clause. He addressed the timing of its inclusion. He addressed the pattern of the 2 previous foreclosures and Caldwell's peripheral involvement. He addressed the licensing proposal and its fee structure and the timeline of its development. When he finished, the room was the quietest it had been all evening. Harmon looked at the council members on either side of him. 2 of them were looking at the table. One was looking at Alcott. One was looking at Caldwell with an expression that had traveled quite far from its starting point. Caldwell stood one more time. He stood with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years being the largest person in every room he entered, and he looked at the council and he said, "This is a misrepresentation of Mr. Caldwell." The voice came from the back of the room. It was Elias Wren. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat in his hand, and the careful neutrality entirely gone from his face, replaced by something considerably more direct. "I came to Willow Creek on your recommendation," Wren said, "to assess a property you described as 2 months from foreclosure. I've since reviewed the financial documents of that property, and I can tell this council that the description you gave me bears no relationship to the financial reality of Carter Ranch." He paused. "I think the council should know who is providing testimony here and what their interests are. That includes mine, and it includes yours." The room exhaled. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of 47 people simultaneously arriving at the same understanding, the quiet collective exhale of a town that had been told one story for a long time and had just been handed a different one and found to its surprise that the different one fit better. Henry Caldwell stood for another moment. Then he sat down. Harmon called for a recess. In the hallway outside the meeting room, Ruth Baines found Eleanor and took her hand in both of hers and didn't say anything, just held it for a moment with the firm warmth of a woman who understood what had just happened in that room and knew that some things don't need words. Franklin Briggs walked past and paused and said, "Mrs. Carter," and tipped his hat, and she nodded to him, and he went on. Pete came out of the meeting room, looking like a young man who had just witnessed something he intended to describe to people for the rest of his life. Thomas stood beside Eleanor in the hallway and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Eleanor." She looked at him. "Whatever happens next," he said, "I need you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "The day you stepped off that stagecoach," he said, "and I stood there with my hat in my hands feeling ashamed of myself." He stopped, started again. "I was the one who needed to be ashamed. Not because of what people were saying, because of the fact that I was listening to them instead of looking at you." He held her gaze. "I see you now. I want you to know that." Eleanor looked at her husband in the hallway of the Willow Creek Town Hall, with the sound of the meeting resuming behind them, and the night air coming in under the door, and the whole uncertain next hour waiting for them. "I know," she said. She straightened her spine and turned back toward the door. "Come on," she said. "We're not done yet." They went back into the room. Oyo. Harmon called the meeting back to order with the careful manner of a man who had spent the recess recalculating every alliance he thought he had, and finding several of them considerably less solid than he'd believed. He sat at the front table and looked at the room, and the room looked back at him, and everyone in it understood that the next few minutes would determine something larger than a licensing proposal. Harmon cleared his throat. "The council will now consider the proposal as submitted," he said. "Before we move to a vote, are there any further statements from the floor?" 3 people stood up. The first was a rancher named Carl Hooper, one of the 4 Thomas had visited that week. He was a big, quiet man in his late 50s who had worked his land for 23 years and was not by nature a man who spoke in public meetings. He stood with his hat in his hands and said, "I've known Thomas Carter since he was a boy. I've watched that ranch struggle since Martha passed. And I want this council to know that in the 6 weeks since Eleanor Carter arrived, Thomas has come to me twice, and both times he was talking about plans, not problems. That's new. I'm telling you that because I think it matters." He sat down. The second was a woman Eleanor didn't recognize, youngish, with a baby on her hip, and the tired, capable look of a homesteader's wife. She stood and said, "My husband drives cattle for the Henderson outfit. We heard Mrs. Carter was going to be feeding crews this fall. My husband told me about it and he said—" She stopped, steadied herself. "He said it was the first time in 3 years he was actually looking forward to the work season, because he'd be eating real food." She sat down. The third person who stood was Samuel Dawson. He stood slowly, the way old men stand when their bones have heard too many winters, and he held his hat in both hands, and he looked at the council for a moment without saying anything, and the room waited for him with the particular patience people extend to someone whose age has earned it. "I've been on Carter Ranch for 31 years, Samuel said. "I worked for Thomas's father. I worked for Thomas. I watched that kitchen go dark after Martha died, and I watched those boys eat salt pork and biscuits for 14 months, because there wasn't anything better, and none of us knew how to fix it." He paused. "Eleanor Carter walked into that kitchen on her first night here, and she fed us. She fed us like people, not like hands." He looked at the council, and then at Henry Caldwell, sitting in the front row. "I don't know much about loan clauses or licensing fees, but I know what it looks like when somebody is trying to put out a fire because it's giving other people warmth. And I've been around long enough to know that kind of man doesn't deserve to win." He sat down. The room was completely quiet. Harmon looked at the council members beside him. He looked at the proposal on the table in front of him. He looked at Henry Caldwell. Caldwell was sitting very still. His face had the particular quality of a man who has spent 30 years in a town and is sitting in it now, understanding for the first time that the town does not entirely belong to him. "The council will vote," Harmon said. The vote was 3-2 against the proposal. Eleanor heard the numbers and felt Thomas's hand tighten around hers, and she breathed in slowly and let it out. 3-2. It was not a landslide. It was not a rout. 2 of those 5 council members had voted to protect Caldwell's interest, and she noted that and filed it away because a town was not won in one evening, and she had never believed it was. But 3-2 was enough. The meeting broke up in pieces, the way meetings do. Some people leaving immediately, and some people finding each other in the way that people find each other when something real has just happened in a shared space, and they need to confirm it with another human face. Alcott appeared at Eleanor's elbow and shook her hand and said, "The loan challenge is solid. We file Monday. I don't think Pritchett will fight it, and if he does, I don't think he'll win." He paused. "You built a good case, Mrs. Carter." "You argued it," she said. "You handed me everything I needed before I walked in the door," he said. "That's the harder part." He moved away, and she turned and Wren was there, which she had not entirely expected. He looked at her for a moment. "I owe you something like an apology," he said. "You don't," she said. "You came here with information you were given. When the information turned out to be wrong, you said so publicly. That's more than most people do." He nodded. He reached into his coat and produced a card, plain white with his name and a Denver address. "The projections," he said. "I meant what I said. I have contacts who invest in operational businesses, not land. If you decide in 6 months that you want to talk about expansion capital, write to me." He paused. "I think what you're building here is going to be worth considerably more than this county can currently see." She took the card. "Thank you, Mr. Wren." He put his hat on and left, and Eleanor stood for a moment with the card in her hand, and the noise of the room around her, and the particular feeling of something having shifted. Not ended. Not resolved entirely, but moved decisively in the direction she had been pushing it. Caldwell passed her on his way to the door. He did not stop. He did not look at her directly, but he slowed just slightly, the barely perceptible slowdown of a man in motion who has made a decision about something, and he said low, and without looking at her, "You're going to find that winning one meeting doesn't mean winning the county." She turned to face him fully. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He stopped. "You're right," she said. "It doesn't, but I'm not trying to win the county." She held his gaze evenly. "I'm trying to build something that deserves to last. Those are different projects, and only one of them requires me to spend my energy preventing other people from succeeding." He looked at her. Then a real look. Not the compressed, calculating look of a man in a negotiation, but something older than that, the look of a man encountering something he has not budgeted for in his understanding of the world. He left without saying anything else. Eleanor watched him go. She thought about what Samuel had told her about Caldwell's son, about the business the boy had tried to build, about the father who couldn't let him. She thought about the particular loneliness of a man whose fear of being outgrown had cost him everything worth keeping. She did not feel sorry for him, but she understood him. And understanding, she had found, was usually enough. Thomas was beside her. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And it was true. They rode home in the dark. The 4 of them, Thomas driving, Eleanor beside him, Samuel and Pete in the back, and nobody said much for the first part of the ride, because there was the particular quiet that descends after a long fight, when the body is still running on the energy of it, and the mind hasn't caught up yet. Pete broke it first, because Pete was 18 and could not sustain silence about something this significant for more than 4 miles. That was, he said. That was something. Nobody argued with him. "Mrs. Carter," Pete said. "When Mr. Alcott walked in, did you know he was going to be there?" "I hoped," she said. "I sent the letter 4 days ago. I didn't know if he'd make it in time." "But he did." "He did." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Did you plan all of it, the whole thing, from the beginning?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I planned for the possibility of most of it," she said. "The council meeting, the loan challenge, the need for a lawyer. I didn't plan for Wren being there. That was something that turned out differently than it started." "Good different or bad different?" "Good," she said. "Usually the things that turn out differently than you expected turn out the way they're supposed to." Pete thought about that. Samuel in the back made a sound that might have been agreement. Thomas drove and said nothing, and Eleanor could feel him beside her, the particular quality of his presence, the way it had changed over 6 weeks, from the careful guardedness of a man bracing for disappointment to something more open than that something that had room in it. When they got back to the ranch and the horse was settled, and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, and Samuel had gone slowly across the yard to his own door, pausing once to look up at the sky, the way old men look at things they have waited a long time to see, Thomas and Eleanor stood in the yard in the dark. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." "In a minute," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ranch, the barns, the kitchen garden that was showing real growth. Now the fencing that Pete and 2 other hands had begun repairing the previous week, the north pasture where the cattle rotation had been adjusted, and the grass was already responding. "It's different," he said. "It looks different." "Things look different when people start caring for them again," she said. He turned to her. In the dark, with just the stars and the light from the kitchen window, his face had lost the careful guardedness entirely. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Are you happy here?" he said. "Not about tonight, not about the contract or the meeting or the numbers. Here, this place. Are you happy?" She had not been asked that question in a long time. She had been asked if she was managing, if she was coping, if she was adjusting. People asked those questions when they expected the answer to be complicated. Nobody had asked her simply plainly if she was happy. She looked at the kitchen window with the light in it. She thought about the morning she had arrived and picked up her own bag because she had learned not to wait for someone to offer. She thought about standing in the kitchen that first evening and understanding what it needed and knowing that she was exactly the person to give it. She thought about Samuel's face when he smelled the pot roast, and Pete asking if he could help with the garden, and Thomas laughing in the kitchen that morning, surprised and real and unguarded. "Yes," she said, "I am." Thomas nodded once. "Good," he said. Then quietly, "So am I," for the first time in a long time. They went inside, and she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, the way they had sat at it 100 times in 6 weeks, with the comfortable ease of people who have learned the specific shape of each other's silences, and they talked until the coffee was cold about what came next, the loan challenge and what Alcott expected from it, the survey crew's arrival in 4 weeks, the 2 additional kitchen hands she planned to hire. She had 2 women in mind, both of them recommended by Ruth Baines, both of them capable and in need of reliable work. The kitchen garden, which was going to need a second plot by spring if the food service kept growing at the rate it was growing. The south pasture and the cattle rotation, and whether they could bring in 2 more hands for the grazing work by summer. They talked about all of it with the focused practical pleasure of people who are building something they believe in, and underneath the practical, there was something else. Something that didn't need to be named to be real. The warmth of 2 people who have come through something difficult together and found on the other side of it that they like who they are when they're standing next to each other. The weeks that followed were the hardest work Eleanor had ever done, and the most satisfying, which she had always believed were the same thing in different clothing. The survey crew arrived on a Wednesday, 62 men in total, trail-worn and hungry, in the particular way of men who have been working hard in open country for months and have stopped expecting meals to be anything more than sustenance. They came to Carter Ranch in shifts the way she had planned for, and she and her 2 new kitchen hands, Clara Marsh and Dottie Reeves, fed them with the same focused care she had brought to that first pot roast on her first night on the ranch. The first shift came in cautious and left quiet in the way Eleanor recognized that particular silence of people who had received something they weren't prepared for. The foreman, a man named Gus Halverson, came to find her after the first meal. He was a practical man, not given to sentiment, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and said, "Mrs. Carter, I've been running survey crews for 16 years. In 16 years, I have never had a man come back from a meal and tell me he needed a minute before he could talk about it." He paused. "I've got 3 of them doing that right now." "Send them back for seconds," she said. He laughed, not politely, the real kind. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Clara and Dottie turned out to be the best decision Eleanor had made, outside of writing to the survey foreman in the first place. Clara was 51, a widow with the kind of calm competence that comes from having managed hard things alone for a long time, and discovered that hard things don't actually get smaller, you just get better at carrying them. Dottie was 34 and fast and funny, and had an instinct for knowing what a dish needed that Eleanor recognized immediately as talent rather than training. Within a week, the three of them worked the kitchen like a single system, anticipating each other, covering each other's gaps, building the kind of quiet professional trust that doesn't need to be discussed because it exists in the work itself. The loan challenge went through in the third week of October. Alcott filed on Monday. By Thursday, Pritchett had agreed to a settlement rather than contest it, which Eleanor had expected, because the evidence of the clause's unusual nature was solid, and Pritchett was a pragmatic man who knew what a losing case looked like. The terms of the settlement included a rate renegotiation, the removal of the threshold clause, and a restructuring of the remaining term that reduced the Carter Ranch monthly obligation by nearly a third. Thomas came home from Cheyenne with the signed documents and put them on the kitchen table, and Eleanor read them from top to bottom, while he stood and watched her and Clara pretended not to be listening from the corner, while she chopped vegetables and absolutely was. When Eleanor finished, she looked up at Thomas. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. Clara said from the corner, "Lord have mercy," and went back to her chopping. Caldwell did not disappear from Willow Creek. Eleanor had never expected him to. He ran his boarding house and attended his council meetings, and operated within the reduced sphere that the October meeting had established for him, and he did not directly interfere with Carter Ranch again. She watched this from a careful distance and understood it for what it was, the particular retreat of a man who has taken a public loss and is deciding how to reposition himself rather than how to acknowledge what happened. She did not trust it entirely. She didn't think she was supposed to. But she also did not spend energy watching for the next move when there was work to do, and meals to cook, and a ranch to build. She had learned somewhere between Cleveland and Willow Creek that you could spend your whole life watching the person who was trying to stop you, or you could spend it building the thing they were afraid of. Not both. There wasn't time for both. She chose the building. In November, the survey crew contract completed, and Halverson's crew moved on to the next section of the line. And on their last morning, Halverson shook Eleanor's hand in the yard and said, "I'm filing our next season's food contract paperwork next month. I'd like Carter Ranch's name on it if you're willing." She was willing. She wrote it in her notebook under the date. Ruth Baines came to the ranch for the first time in mid-November, ostensibly to discuss the dairy supply arrangements for the winter, but actually, Eleanor understood to see the place she had been hearing about for months. She came in her good coat and sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of a woman who had run her own operation for decades and knew what a well-run space felt like. "You've done something here," Ruth said. "We've done something here," Eleanor said. "The we matters." Ruth looked at her. "Don't be modest," she said not unkindly. "Modesty is for people who don't know their own value. You know yours." Eleanor smiled at that. She didn't argue. Ruth stayed for lunch and ate with Thomas and Samuel and Pete and Dottie because Clara had the day off, and the table was loud in the particular way Eleanor loved overlapping conversations, and someone laughing at something Pete had said, and Thomas passing the bread without being asked, and Samuel eating with the steady, satisfied attention of a man who had stopped expecting meals to be something other than what they were, and was still occasionally surprised by the fact that they were something more. After lunch, Ruth put on her coat to leave and stopped at the door. "There's something I want to tell you," Ruth said. "About the night of the council meeting. Before you went back inside after the recess." Eleanor waited. "I watched your face," Ruth said. "When Harmon called the recess, and you didn't know yet how the vote was going to go." She paused. "Most people, when they're that uncertain about something that matters that much, it shows. The fear shows." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "Yours didn't. You looked like a woman who had done everything she could do and was at peace with that, whatever came next. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I don't know that it was peace," she said. "I think it was just clarity. I knew I'd done the work. Whatever the vote was that was true." "Yes," Ruth said. "That's what I mean." She buttoned her coat. "You're going to be all right here, Eleanor. I want you to know I believe that." She left. Eleanor stood at the door for a moment, after Ruth's wagon had moved down the road, and she let herself feel the weight of that sentence, the particular warmth of being told by a woman you respect that she sees you clearly and believes in what she sees. It was, she thought, one of the finest things anyone had said to her. She went back inside and picked up her notebook. In December, Thomas put Eleanor's name on the ranch ownership papers. He did it quietly, without ceremony, on a Tuesday morning after breakfast, when the hands had gone out to their work, and the kitchen was clean, and the two of them were sitting at the table with their coffee, and the particular morning quiet that had become over 5 months one of Eleanor's favorite things in the world. He slid the documents across the table. She looked at them, then at him. "I had Alcott draw them up while he was here for the loan," Thomas said. "I've been waiting for the right time." "I don't think there is a right time. I think there's just the time when you decide to do it." Eleanor looked at the documents, her name printed cleanly next to his on the ownership line. Eleanor Whitmore Carter, Carter Ranch. "Thomas," she said. "You earned it," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it, but I want you to know that it's true." "Then why are you doing it?" she said. He held her gaze. "Because it's right," he said. "Because this place is yours as much as it's mine. Because you walked in here with one bag and 2 hands, and you built something I couldn't have built in 10 more years alone, and I don't want there to ever be any question, legal or otherwise, about whether you belong here." Eleanor looked at the documents for another moment. Then she picked up the pen he had placed beside them and signed her name, and the signature was steady and clean and without hesitation, because she had never once in her life been uncertain about who she was. She set the pen down. Thomas reached across the table, and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that for a moment in the kitchen that had been dark for 14 months and was now the warmest room in the county, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. By the time the year turned, Carter Ranch was not the same place it had been when Eleanor stepped off the stagecoach in the summer dust. The loan was restructured and paying down cleanly. The kitchen garden had been winterized properly and would come back stronger in spring. Clara and Dottie were permanent, and Eleanor had begun conversations with 2 more women about seasonal work for the cattle drive season. The south pasture rotation was corrected, and the cattle were showing it. 3 of the 7 original hands had told Thomas directly that they planned to stay, which was something none of them had said the previous winter. The second survey contract was signed in January. A cattlemen's association 2 counties over had written to ask about supplying meals for their spring roundup. The woman who ran the schoolhouse in Willow Creek had asked Eleanor if she would be willing to speak to the older girls about household account management. She had said yes. She said yes to a great deal in those months, but she said it selectively, the way you say yes when you understand the difference between what grows your foundation and what just makes you busy. And she had learned that difference in her grandmother's kitchen and refined it in Cleveland and brought it with her to Wyoming in one leather bag. In February, Pete came to her with a piece of paper in his hand. He had been working on something in the evenings. She had noticed something he kept in the inside pocket of his coat, and she had not asked because she understood the particular privacy of a young person trying to make something without an audience before it was ready to be seen. He put the paper on the kitchen table. It was a set of calculations, rough but logical. A small horse operation he wanted to propose using the north corner of the Carter pasture that had been unused since the previous summer. He had worked out the feed costs and the startup requirements and a rough timeline for when it might begin producing income. He had made errors in 2 of the calculations, small ones, but the structure of the thinking was sound. He stood there while she read it with his hands in his pockets, and the specific vulnerability of someone who has made a thing and is not yet sure if it deserves to exist. Eleanor read the whole page, Then she turned it over and started correcting the two calculations. Pete watched her do it. "So it's wrong," he said. "Two numbers are wrong," she said. "The thinking isn't." She finished the corrections and pushed it back to him. "You'll need to talk to Thomas about the pasture. That's his decision to make, not mine. But I'd suggest talking to him about it directly, not waiting for the right moment, because the right moment doesn't come, you have to make it." Pete looked at the corrected calculations, then at her. "Did you always know how to do this?" he said. "The planning, the numbers, all of it." "No," she said. "I learned it. The way you learn anything. By doing it badly first and paying attention to where the errors were." "Did people think you were stupid while you were learning?" She looked at him steadily. "People thought I was a great many things while I was learning," she said. "Most of which had nothing to do with my intelligence and everything to do with what I looked like." She held his gaze. "That's their limitation. Not yours, not mine." Pete nodded slowly, seriously, the nod of a young man receiving something he intends to keep. "Go talk to Thomas," she said. "Today, before supper." He went. Thomas agreed to the north pasture. Eleanor had known he would. She had watched him become, over the course of 5 months, a man who said yes to things that were worth building, and Pete's idea was worth building, and Thomas Carter knew it. She did not consider this her doing. She considered it Thomas's doing, the slow unclenching of a man who had been holding himself against possibility for too long and had finally let go. She had given him room to do it. That was all she had given him. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, stubborn and cold, and then all at once the way things that have been held back tend to arrive when they finally come fast and total and impossible to prepare for. The kitchen garden came up stronger than Eleanor had hoped. The first cattle drive crew of the season came through in April, 43 men, and Clara ran the morning shifts while Dottie ran the evening ones, and Eleanor moved between them like a woman who knows every part of her own operation so well that she can be anywhere it needs her. The Cattlemen's Association Roundup contract came through in May. Halverson sent a letter in June, saying the fall survey contract would be bigger than the previous year, more men, more weeks, and he had recommended Carter Ranch to 2 other survey foremen working adjacent lines. In June, on a warm evening with the light going gold over the pastures, Eleanor sat on the porch of the main house with a cup of coffee and her notebook, and the sounds of the ranch around her, Pete working with the horses in the north corner, Samuel moving between the barn and the bunkhouse with the unhurried purpose of a man who has found his pace and intends to keep it, Thomas, somewhere in the south pasture, visible as a small figure against the long grass. She opened her notebook. The first page, the page she had written at 4 a.m. on her second day, the page with the numbers and the problems and the list of everything that needed fixing, was still there. She looked at it for a long time. The numbers that had been wrong. The systems that had been broken. The garden that had been dead. She turned to the current page. The current numbers were different. She wrote for a while, updates and projections, and a note to herself about the spring planting for next year, and then she closed the notebook and held her coffee with both hands and looked out at the ranch. Thomas came back from the south pasture as the light was fading, and he came up to the porch and sat in the other chair and accepted the cup she poured for him without asking, and they sat together in the warm Wyoming evening with the sounds of the ranch around them. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said. "Grass is coming in right on the rotation schedule." "I know," she said. "I checked this morning." He smiled. Not at her. Just into the evening, the private smile of a man who has stopped being surprised by his wife's competence and started simply being grateful for it. "Eleanor," he said. "Do you remember what you said to me?" he said. "That first morning. When I asked you why you came here." She remembered. "I said I was very good at this," she said, "and that I was tired of being in places that wouldn't let me prove it." "Yes," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that lately. About the fact that everyone in this town saw you step off that stagecoach and decided what you were before you'd done a single thing." He turned to look at her. "And you came here anyway. knowing they'd do that. You came anyway. I came because the work was here, she said. The people didn't matter. They matter now, he said. She considered that. They matter now, she agreed. Because they're different now. Or... She paused. We're different, and the difference is visible. You made it visible, he said. She looked at him. We made it visible, she said. Thomas, you have to stop giving me all of it. Some of it is you. The ranchers who came to the council meeting, they came because they respect you. The crew who stayed, they stayed because of who you are when you're not too tired to be it. She held his gaze. You were worth saving. I just helped you see it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that as the evening settled around the ranch, the gold going out of the light and the stars coming on one at a time. The kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of the sounds of a living place. Horses and wind. And somewhere across the yard, Samuel Dawson's low voice telling Pete something long and unhurried. Margaret Hale stopped Eleanor on the main street of Willow Creek the following Thursday, not to say anything unkind. That time apparently had passed. She stopped her with the particular awkwardness of a woman who has been wrong about something publicly and has spent several months deciding what to do about it. Mrs. Carter, she said. Mrs. Hale, Eleanor said. Margaret Hale looked at her with the careful eyes of a woman taking a true account. I want to tell you something, she said. And I want you to know I mean it. Eleanor waited. The day you arrived, Margaret said, I said something cruel within your hearing. I don't know if you heard it. I heard it, Eleanor said. Margaret absorbed that. Then I owe you a direct apology, she said. Not an explanation. I know better than what I did that day. I just didn't do better, and that's on me. Eleanor looked at her, not with warmth, not yet, but with the honest attention she gave everything. I appreciate that, she said. Truly, Margaret nodded. She started to turn away, then stopped. The dinner, she said. The community dinner you're planning for the summer. My daughter helps organize the church social. She said she'd asked you about combining efforts. She did, Eleanor said. I told her I'd consider it. Consider it favorably, Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humility, but was the thing that lives next door to it, the thing you get to when pride has been examined honestly. The town could use more of what you do. She walked away down the boardwalk. Eleanor stood for a moment and watched her go, and felt the specific satisfaction of something having moved that she had not pushed, having moved on its own, because the truth given enough time and enough clear demonstration usually does. She turned and continued down the street toward the supply office, where she had an appointment with the railroad agent about the fall contracts. She walked the way she had always walked, which was the way she had learned to walk in a world that had opinions about her body, before it had interest in her mind, straight and unhurried and entirely herself. The summer community dinner happened on a Saturday in July, and 112 people came. Eleanor did not cook all of it. She had learned over the course of a year that the best thing a person who is good at building things can do is teach other people how to build them. Because the thing you build alone is always smaller than the thing you build together. Clara ran the beef operation with 3 women she had trained herself. Dottie managed the bread and the sweets with 2 girls from town who had started coming to the ranch kitchen on Thursday afternoons to learn. Ruth Baines supplied everything dairy-related and stood at the table beside Eleanor with the proprietary pleasure of a woman who has made something good and knows it. Pete organized the tables with the officious seriousness of someone given real responsibility for the first time and determined not to waste it. Samuel moved through the whole event slowly and steadily, appearing where he was needed, saying little, watching everything with the particular expression Eleanor had come to think of as his. The look of a man who has lived long enough to know the difference between moments that matter and moments that only seem to. This one mattered. He knew it. Thomas worked the edge of the crowd, The way a man works a space when he is still learning to be comfortable in it, still learning that what his wife had built reflected well on him rather than diminishing him. Eleanor watched him from across the tables, and she watched the moment somewhere in the middle of the afternoon when something released in him completely, when he stopped moving on the edge and came into the center of it, and shook hands with Carl Hooper, and laughed at something real, and stood in the middle of his own community, and looked like a man who lived there. She watched that, and felt it, and went back to what she was doing. At the end of the afternoon, when the food was nearly gone, and the light was going amber, and people were beginning the slow, contented movement toward home that happens at the end of a day that has given them something real. Eleanor stood at the edge of it all and looked out at what the day had made. People fed. Relationships built or rebuilt. A town that had laughed at a woman stepping off a stagecoach now eating food she had taught other women to make. Now sitting at tables she had organized. Now living in a place that was quietly different, because she had arrived in it and refused to be what they expected. Ruth came and stood beside her. "You should be proud," Ruth said. "I am," Eleanor said simply. Thomas found her as the last of the guests were leaving, and he stood beside her and looked out at the emptying tables and the long light over the pastures and the kitchen garden visible at the edge of the yard, green and growing, and nothing like the dead, cracked ground she had pressed her fingers into that first evening. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The day I placed that advertisement," he said, "I was ashamed of the ranch, of myself, of needing help. I wrote it like I was admitting defeat." Eleanor looked at him. "And then you arrived," he said. "And everything I was ashamed of turned out to be the thing that brought you here." He met her eyes. "I've been thinking about that a lot. About how the thing you think is the proof of your failure is sometimes just the door." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married in desperation and found to be underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the careful guardedness someone worth knowing. Someone worth standing beside. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him slightly, not dramatically. Just the easy, unself-conscious lean of a woman who has decided where she belongs and found that it holds her weight. The ranch was quiet around them. The light was going down over the Wyoming hills, long and gold, and without apology. Somewhere a horse moved in the north pasture, and somewhere Pete was telling Samuel something that Samuel was listening to with his particular patience, and somewhere Clara was finishing in the kitchen, and the sound of it was clean and domestic and right. Eleanor Whitmore. Carter stood in the yard of the ranch she had saved and helped build and signed her name to, and she felt the truth of it settle into her bones the way good things settle when they are real and earned and permanent. She had arrived in a town that laughed at her. She had stayed and done the work. And the work had built something that no amount of fear or contempt or deliberate interference could touch, because it was built on the only foundation that ever holds the foundation of people being genuinely fed, genuinely seen, genuinely cared for, in the particular way that only happens when the person doing the caring has decided that the work matters more than the opinion of anyone who doubts it. Eleanor had decided that a long time ago. In the summer dust of Willow Creek, Wyoming in the year 1884, she had picked up her own bag and walked forward, and the rest of it, all of it, every contract and every legal document and every meal and every morning in the kitchen before sunrise had followed from that single, unhesitating step. She had come knowing what she was worth. She had simply waited for the world to catch up. And in the end, the way it always ends when someone refuses to be less than they are, the world did.